They say the walls of a corporate office have ears, but sometimes they also have secrets. I was sitting across from HR, the termination letter still warm from the printer. I wasn't crying, I wasn't begging. I was doing what I'd always done, staying calm, silent, composed. My name is Jenna McAllister, and that morning, I'd been fired after 7 loyal years at Montrose Financial Group. My crime? I refused to lie for my boss. The moment I walked out of that glass tower with a cardboard box in my arms, something inside me shifted. That pristine lobby, those marble floors, the fake smiles, I saw them for what they really were, polished veneers hiding rot. But what they didn't know was that I'd kept receipts. Literal ones. Because my boss, Richard Talbot, Senior Vice President of Operations, had been using company money to fund hotel getaways, with a junior analyst who wasn't his wife. And now, because I refused to create a bogus travel report to cover it up, I was labeled disruptive, non-compliant, and terminated effective immediately. He thought I'd just walk away. But that evening, I sent an anonymous email, and the first name on the recipient list, Richard's wife. I hadn't always been the kind of person to retaliate. I believed in hard work, loyalty, keeping my head down, and earning respect the right way. But when Richard made me choose between my job and my integrity, he lit a fire I didn't even know was there. And that fire? It was just getting started. It started with a knock on Richard's office door 6 weeks ago. I had just finished reconciling the Q2 vendor reports when he summoned me with that casual arrogance he always wore like a suit. "Close the door, Jenna," he said, not looking up from his screen. That was never a good sign. Then came the folder. Inside, travel logs, hotel receipts, and a request to submit a false reimbursement report for a business trip that by every metric never happened. Except it had happened, but not the way he wanted it to look. The Hilton charges weren't for client dinners. They were for room service, spa treatments, and a suite that had been booked for 2. "Just clean it up," Richard said. "Make it look legit." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. "Rich," I said carefully, "this isn't just unethical, it's embezzlement. If anyone audits this..." He cut me off. "No one's auditing anything. You're overthinking it. Just do what you're told." When I didn't budge, his voice dropped into something colder. "I hired you out of loyalty, Jenna. Don't make me regret it." That's when I realized I was expendable. 7 years of working overtime, taking on projects no one wanted, mentoring interns. None of it mattered now. He expected me to risk everything to protect a man cheating on both his wife and the company. I left his office without a word. I didn't touch the file. 2 days later, I was called into HR. They said my attitude had become concerning, that I had been combative, that Richard no longer felt comfortable with me managing sensitive financial documents. I was stunned. And then came the final insult. An offer, 2 weeks of severance if I agreed to resign quietly, no unemployment, no questions, and a signed NDA. I refused, and so they fired me. My coworkers looked at me with that mixture of pity and fear, the kind you give someone who's been made an example of. No one asked questions, no one spoke up. But someone did look me in the eye as I left. Maya, one of our junior analysts. Her expression wasn't pity. It was confusion. And something else I couldn't place then. I didn't cry until I got home. Not because of the job, because I knew what they'd just done wasn't personal. It was calculated, cold, routine. They'd done it before, and they'd do it again. But this time, they'd picked the wrong woman. Because in addition to every transaction I'd processed, every report I'd filed, every questionable expense I'd buried under miscellaneous, I'd also kept copies. Not for revenge. Not at first. But because I always suspected Richard Talbot's downfall wouldn't come from an external audit. It would come from someone who once believed in him. You learn a lot in 7 years behind the curtain of a corporation like Montrose. I wasn't flashy like some of the others, no designer heels, no loud networking. But I knew where everything lived. How expense reports were coded, how training retreats were used to cover for affairs, and how certain invoices vanished during quarterly cleanups. I knew who was protected and who was disposable. Richard thought I was just another cog, efficient, invisible, obedient. What he didn't know was that I had a photographic memory and a habit of backing up everything. Encrypted files, burner emails, even printed records stored in a fireproof box under my bed. Not because I planned to use them, but because I never fully trusted the system. I'd seen too many good people chewed up and spit out while others rose through the ranks with nothing but charm and secrets. And Richard? He was the king of secrets. That evening after they fired me, I brewed a pot of coffee and sat down at my kitchen table. I opened a new anonymous email account. I typed one sentence: "You deserve the truth." Attached, a PDF containing hotel bills, timestamp messages between Richard and his mistress, and a company travel report with obvious discrepancies. Recipient: Melissa Talbot, his wife. But that was just the beginning. I also blind copied someone else. Roger Denton, chief legal officer at Montrose. Roger and I had barely interacted. But I remembered something from 3 years ago, a budget meeting, where Richard had casually joked about Roger's zero tolerance for ethics violations. "He'll drop a director faster than a hot stock if they so much as fudge a parking receipt," Richard had laughed. I remembered the way Roger's face didn't move when Richard made that joke, so I sent it to him too. No accusations. Just facts. Time-stamped. Documented. Then I waited. And while I waited, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Arlene Marks, a former project manager who had mysteriously resigned last year. No goodbye party. No farewell email. She picked up on the first ring. "Jenna?" Her voice was cautious. "I think we were both burned by the same man," I said. There was a pause. Then she said, "Meet me tomorrow. I have something you need to see." And just like that, the gear started to turn. I wasn't seeking revenge, not yet. But I wanted answers. Why had so many talented women quietly disappeared from Montrose over the years? Why had Richard risen higher each time? And if I could prove that I wasn't just collateral damage, but part of a pattern, then maybe I wasn't the only one who needed to speak up. The truth was, I'd never wanted a war. But I was starting to realize I'd been drafted into one a long time ago. And now that I had nothing left to lose, I was finally ready to fight. Arlene and I met at a little diner just outside the city, neutral territory, away from Montrose eyes. She looked the same as ever, sharp blazer, hair pulled tight, eyes constantly scanning the room. But the moment she slid into the booth, I saw the exhaustion beneath it all. "Let me guess," she said, "Richard." I nodded. She sighed and pulled out a manila folder from her bag. I didn't go quietly, I just went quietly public. Inside were signed statements, 4 of them. Former employees, all women. Each one described a similar pattern: being pressured into covering for Richard's affairs, ghost-written reports, excessive write-offs, gaslighting, then being labeled unreliable and pushed out with severance packages and NDAs. Arlene leaned in. "I tried to bring this to legal last year, but they shut it down, said without direct proof of coercion, it was hearsay. Then HR started documenting my poor leadership behavior. I was out a month later. I felt my stomach turn. This wasn't just my story, it was a system. Why didn't you go public? I asked. I didn't have your receipts, she said quietly, but maybe, together, we have enough. That night, I created a shared drive, a secure one. I uploaded everything: emails, spreadsheets, flagged expenses, calendar logs. Arlene added her own. We built a timeline, matched dates, highlighted inconsistencies, and the more we dug, the clearer it became. Richard hadn't just been cheating on his wife, he'd been cheating the company. Repeatedly, systematically, and HR had helped him do it. We weren't just dealing with a bad boss, we were staring at the rot inside Montrose's executive leadership. And the stakes? They weren't just my career anymore, because if this got out, shareholders would panic. There would be audits, investigations, heads would roll. Which made what happened next even more dangerous. 3 days after I sent the anonymous email, I got a call from a blocked number. I almost didn't answer. "Is this Jenna McAllister?" the voice asked. "Who's asking?" "This is Roger Denton." Silence. "I'd like to meet with you, off the record, tomorrow." When we met, Roger brought a legal pad. I brought a copy of everything. He didn't speak for a long time as he read. Then he looked up at me and said, "We need to be very careful about how we move forward." And that's when I realized he already knew part of it. Maybe not the full extent, but enough to recognize what this meant. "Help me," I said, "and I'll help you clean house." He nodded. That was the beginning of our alliance. Because Richard still held power, still held the loyalty of key players in HR and operations. But now I had allies too, and this was no longer about my job. This was about truth, about justice, and about pulling down a man who had built his empire on manipulation, lies, and the broken careers of women who were too afraid, or too alone, to fight back. Until now. By the time Roger and I left that coffee shop, we had a silent agreement. Exposure wouldn't be loud, it would be surgical. Controlled, corporate. Montrose wouldn't survive a scandal of this size dumped online. But it could survive a purge, if it was done right. That's when we began Phase 1, leverage the board. Roger discreetly scheduled a closed-door audit committee meeting with 3 independent directors. He presented the findings, redacted, sanitized, no names attached. Just raw numbers and timelines. The data spoke for itself. Over $250,000 in misappropriated travel funds, conflicting reports, unapproved vendors, reimbursements with no correlating business justification. The board didn't know my name yet, but they knew someone inside had the receipts, and they knew legal liability when they saw it. Meanwhile, I played my part in the shadows. I reached out to Maya, the junior analyst who had looked at me strangely when I was fired. Turns out, she had seen Richard and the analyst he was sleeping with enter a hotel together during a client offsite. She also had screenshots of Slack messages from HR discussing my exit strategy 2 weeks before they even called me in. "I didn't know what to do with them," Maya said. "But if you're really doing this..." "I'm doing this," I told her. And just like that, another voice joined the file. Arlene, Maya, and I began referring to ourselves half-jokingly as the Ledger Ladies, the ones who saw the numbers behind the stories and had finally decided to write one of our own. But I knew Richard. He wasn't stupid. He'd catch wind of something soon. And right on cue, a week after the audit committee meeting, he called me. At first I didn't answer. Then he emailed. "Let's talk. We can clean this up." I couldn't believe the gall. I forwarded the email to Roger and said, "Time to show them who he really is." Phase 2, set the trap. Roger scheduled another meeting, this time with the full audit board and Montrose's outside counsel. In that meeting, Richard was asked to account for several expense reports flagged in the internal review. He deflected, lied, said the reports had been filed by his assistant, me. That's when Roger dropped the packet. Hard copy. Signed by me months ago. With real numbers, real bookings, and an affidavit I'd signed just days earlier. They confronted him with it. And Richard? He snapped. He accused Roger of setting him up, said I was a disgruntled ex-employee trying to destroy him. He lost his composure, shouted. It was over in 10 minutes. The board didn't need a full investigation anymore. They had everything they needed to invoke the ethics and compliance clause in his executive contract. Effective immediately, Richard Talbot was placed on unpaid administrative leave pending formal dismissal procedures. But I wasn't done yet. Because Phase 3 was public vindication. And the best part? I wasn't the one who was going to pull that trigger. 2 weeks after Richard was escorted out of the building, his face pale, eyes darting as if trying to understand how the walls had suddenly closed in, I got a call from a familiar number. The executive chairman of the Montrose board. "Miss McAllister," he said, "we owe you an apology, and perhaps more than that." Turns out, Roger had briefed the board on my full involvement, not just as a whistleblower, but as the architect of the entire case. The documentation, the cross-reference timelines, the internal connections that made sense of the chaos. In their words, I hadn't just saved Montrose from a scandal, I'd preserved it from destruction. And now, they wanted me back, not as Richard's assistant, not in operations, as head of ethics and compliance. I was stunned. For a moment I just sat there in silence, phone pressed to my ear. "Are you serious?" I finally asked. "Completely," he said. "The board has voted unanimously. We believe the company needs someone who's lived through the consequences of our blind spots and fought to fix them." That was the vindication. Not just reinstatement, but elevation. Not behind a desk taking orders, but at the table where the decisions were made. But the best part? It wasn't even my doing. Because the real trigger was Melissa Talbot. She had received that anonymous email weeks earlier, and she'd quietly begun her own investigation. Hired a private attorney. Found years of betrayal and financial manipulation in their personal lives too. Once Richard was exposed at work, she filed for divorce. But not before leaking her findings to a journalist friend at the Daily Ledger, who published a full exposé titled "The Rise and Fall of Montrose's Golden Boy: How One Executive Burned Through Ethics, Trust, and Millions." The story went viral, and with it came the final twist, because buried in that article, nearly unnoticed by the public, but not by those of us in the know, was a single line. An internal tip from a former assistant started the unraveling. That was all. No name. But everyone inside Montrose knew exactly who it was. The woman Richard had dismissed, humiliated, labeled unstable and emotional. The one he underestimated. Jenna McAllister. By the time I walked back into Montrose headquarters, it felt like the building itself had changed. People looked at me differently, some with respect, some with unease, some with open admiration. I didn't need an apology from them. The new job, the changes in leadership, the quiet dismantling of toxic HR heads, that was enough. And the best part? I made sure my first act in my new role was to reopen 3 old HR cases, ones marked resolved without full investigation. Arlene's was one of them. Within a month, she was back as Director of Special Projects. Maya, promoted to Senior Analyst. The Ledger ladies had come full circle. We didn't just take down a predator, we rewrote the rulebook, and in the end, Richard's arrogance was his undoing. Because he thought I was small. He thought I was disposable. What he didn't know? I never forget anything.